SOHO stands for Small Office, Home Office, and is a term used to describe a working environment with fewer than 10 employees. By relation, a SOHO network is a networking environment that supports this smaller office model. A SOHO network typically consists of a single router connected to the internet. Oftentimes, this router is a device that combines the functionalities of a router, switch, and wireless access point into a single device. The network itself has between 1 to 10 devices that use either a wired or wireless connection. Most SOHO networks don't use dedicated servers, such as print, web, or file servers. Instead, a SOHO environment will do things like connect a wireless printer to the network for printing, or share files using a workgroup model, where each computer simply shares specific folders for others to access. Sometimes, a network-attached storage device designed for SOHO networks will be used. The key thing to remember is that a SOHO network typically uses standard, consumer-level devices. You aren't going to see enterprise-level 24-port managed switches in this type of networking environment. The SOHO router is the heart of the SOHO network. This router not only connects devices, but it also fulfills multiple roles. Because of this, it's important that you know not only how to manage and configure one, but also how to select an appropriate SOHO router for various types of SOHO networks. The first thing to consider when selecting a router is the internet connection being used. A lot of routers are able to also function as an internet modem, for say, a cable internet or DSL internet connection. For example, it's possible to purchase a router that has RJ11 port and functions as a DSL modem. Instead of having both a router and a DSL modem, you could have a single device that has the functionality of both. However, sometimes a router-modem combination device might not offer all of the functionalities that you need. In addition, some internet services don't use a modem and simply use an Ethernet cable with an RJ45 connector. If either is the case, you can simply purchase a router that has an RJ45 port on the back and connect it to the dedicated internet modem or Ethernet cable. The same is true with wireless functionality. As I said earlier, a lot of routers also function as a wireless access point, but again, you might want a more robust wireless access point. If this is the case, it might be better to select a router with only wired functionality and purchase a separate wireless access point and connect it to the router. After the router has been selected, there are some key steps that should be taken anytime you're setting up a new router. The first step is to change the default login credentials. Most routers use a default username of admin. Some routers allow you to change this, but a lot of SOHO routers don't offer this functionality. However, all routers allow you to change the password, and this should be done immediately. Change the password to something complex that uses numbers, symbols, as well as lowercase and uppercase letters. The next thing you should do is update the router to the latest firmware version. Even though the router might be brand new, the firmware update will fix bugs, security vulnerabilities, and might even add additional features. And finally, configure the router's firewall settings. Most SOHO routers will have an integrated firewall feature that blocks external attacks. Make sure the firewall is enabled and configured properly. The firewall can also be used to block specific services, such as torrent applications that use up a lot of bandwidth. If the router also functions as a wireless access point, you should also change the default SSID and configure authentication and encryption. For most SOHO environments, selecting WPA2 Personal is the best wireless configuration. After you've selected the appropriate router and connected it either directly to the internet or to the internet modem, you need to configure it to connect to the internet. The way this is done depends on the type of internet connection and router you have selected. The most common method to establish an internet connection is to configure the router to use DHCP. With DHCP, the router contacts the ISP's DHCP server, which provides the router with all the necessary configuration information, including IP address, subnet mask, and DNS server. Sometimes the ISP will provide you with this information, which you then need to manually configure on the router. This is known as static configuration. If the internet service is DSL, you may have to configure the router to use PPPoE. PPPoE is a protocol, typically used by DSL providers, that allows them to regulate internet access using username and password authentication. After the internet connection has been established, the next step is to allow hosts to connect to the network and obtain internet access. To do this, the router uses a networking technique called network address translation, or NAT. Without NAT, every single device on this network would need to have a unique internet IP address. The reason for this is because all sent and received packets need a source and destination IP address. Devices on the internet need to know where data is coming from and where data should be sent. But remember, IP addresses are limited. Because of this, ISPs will only assign a single internet IP address, also called a public IP address, to subscribers. So what NAT does is assign internal devices a private IP address, such as 10.0.0.1, and associates the private IP address with the public IP address used by the router. This allows for multiple devices to use the same public IP address. It works like this. Using NAT, let's say this host visits a website. The request is sent to the router with the website as the destination and the host's private IP address as the source address. When the router receives this request, it does two things. First, it strips off the source address and replaces it with the router's public IP address. If the private IP address was left, the request would never be returned. Now, if the router were to send the request off at this point, there would be a problem. When returned, the router wouldn't know which of the internal hosts made the website request. Remember, it stripped the private IP address and replaced it with its public IP address. So, before sending the request, NAT uses a technique called port address translation, or PAT. What PAT does is append a randomly selected port number between 49,152 and 65,535 to the end of the public IP address, for example, 51,400. The router then places an entry in its translation table to associate the random port number with the private IP address that was removed. The request is then sent to the website. When the router receives the website's response, it'll compare the dynamically assigned port number with the translation table to see which private IP address made the request, and it'll forward the information on to the host. By assigning internal hosts private IP addresses and using a NAT router, the same public IP address can be shared by hundreds of devices, but you need to make sure you configure the router and hosts with private IP address. The Internet Assigned Number Authority, IANA, has assigned three IP address ranges for private use. These are 10.0.0.0 to 10.255.255.255, 172.16.0.0 to 172.31.255.255, and 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255. By default, most routers are configured to assign hosts an IP address in the private IP address range of 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255. This is a Class C address, so it has a default subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. For example, this router could be configured to use a network address of 192.168.1.0. The last octet would then be used to assign the host address to devices. This configuration provides up to 254 unique IP addresses, which is more than enough for a SOHO environment. Know that because the router is considered a device on the network, it is assigned a private IP address. Routers will typically be assigned the first available host address. In this example, the router would be assigned an IP address of 192.168.1.1. This IP address is used to connect to the router and make configuration changes. It's also used as the default gateway and DNS server address when configuring hosts. Hosts that connect to the network should be configured to automatically obtain TCP/IP configuration information from a DHCP server. Remember, a SOHO router is a multifunction device. Not only does it function as router and switch, but it also functions as a DHCP server. This allows it to automatically configure hosts with all the necessary TCP/IP configuration settings, including an IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, and DNS server. So, those are the basics of a SOHO environment and the steps you should take when configuring a SOHO network using a router. Remember, the heart of a SOHO network is the SOHO router, which combines the functionality of several devices. When selecting a SOHO router, make sure to select one that can provide all the functionality required in the SOHO environment, which might include things like an integrated internet modem or wireless access point.